The biopsychosocial model helps us understand that our health isn't shaped by just one thing. Biologically, it includes factors like genetics, brain chemistry, physical health, substance use, sleep, and nutrition. These interact with our psychology, things like past experiences, coping skills, self esteem, personality, emotional intelligence, and thought patterns. And then we have the social side of our beings, our economic circumstances, the culture we live in, whether we have access to healthcare, a safe environment, and supportive relationships. All of these pieces overlap and influence each other, which is why this model is useful in considering the whole person, not just one part. This model helps us understand, not judge. It reminds us that challenges are multi-layered and that it's okay. The biopsychosocial model can highlight where our strengths and vulnerabilities lie, and we will be discussing it to reflect on depression. Reflecting on the factors within each sphere of influence can help hold us accountable and empower us to take active steps towards better mental health outcomes. I'll be using the phrase positive feedback loops of depression because I think it's very helpful in understanding what actions, behaviors, decisions will either promote depression or will help to phase out depression. The phrase positive feedback loop has its roots in cybernetics and systems theory. Eventually, by the 1950s, 1960s, the phrase positive feedback loop was standard in biology, psychology, and sociology to describe self-amplifying processes. Let's first define positive feedback loop in the broad sense. A positive feedback loop happens when a change in a system causes effects that amplify or reinforce that original change, making it stronger and pushing the system further in the same direction. It is a feedback loop that is self-reinforcing. Unlike a negative feedback loop, which stabilizes systems, a positive loop moves things away from balance and can cause rapid shifts. Don't be fooled by the word positive. Positive feedback loops are not always a positive thing, and hence I'll be using it to describe actions or behaviors, decisions that can potentially lend themselves to positive feedback loops of depression. Now, in the context of the biopsychosocial model, a positive feedback loop of depression is a self-reinforcing cycle in which difficulties in one sphere of influence, biological, psychological, or social, exacerbate or create problems in the other two spheres. This back and forth interaction of these three spheres of influence can strengthen and or perpetuate depressive symptoms, making recovery from depression more difficult over time. Here's a word of caution to further clarify. Please understand that I will not be using the phrase positive feedback loop of depression to describe situations where temporary conflict arises as a result of the need to address aspects of these spheres of influence. For example, committing to quitting alcohol might solicit temporary conflict in our social lives as we grieve relationships that promote substance abuse or we opt out of social gatherings that will tempt us. That person quitting alcohol might also experience withdrawal symptoms that include irritability, shakiness, anxiety, and nausea. And now that alcohol is out of the picture, in the attempt to quit alcohol, that person could find themselves needing to wrestle with their sober thoughts and struggling to assert their self-esteem, perhaps through affirmations they once considered corny or coming to terms with underlying undealt with trauma. Clearly, quitting alcohol will create problems in all of these three spheres of influence, but that decision to quit alcohol will not be said as something that creates a positive feedback loop of depression because it is inspired by an effort to obtain better mental health overall and in the long run. I don't want to mislead anyone in pretending that addressing certain factors of our biology, psychology, or sociology will not potentially induce conflict because that's naive and unrealistic. Unfortunately, making decisions that will generate better mental health in the long run will often, but hopefully only temporarily, create distress in multiple spheres of influence. But again, if the conflict generates better mental health in the long run, then that is not conflict that I will be referring to as lending itself to a positive feedback loop of depression. Let's consider a very simple example without a lot of nuance. In order to paint a picture of challenges in each sphere of influence that could yield a positive feedback loop of depression if left untreated. In other words, I'll be mentioning factors that have the potential to spiral into worse mental health outcomes over time. Let's make this example about a middle-aged female. Maybe she has a husband, maybe she has 2 kids, and she goes to work. She is a full-time working parent. For whatever reason, this middle-aged female has been experiencing chronic sleep disruption for the last 2 weeks. Let's say she has only been able to get about 3 to 4 hours of sleep each night for the last 2 weeks. I would not wish that on anyone. As we'll later discuss, sleep is very fundamental to mental health. All right, so this middle-aged female is experiencing chronic sleep deprivation for the last 2 weeks, and she's waking up every day more irritable. The effects of that chronic sleep disruption are now bleeding into her interpersonal relationships at home with her family and with the colleagues that she has at work. At work, she's expressing less and less patience with her colleagues. She has a reduced ability to reframe interactions at work as well. Maybe she's having a hard time letting little things go. Maybe she's taking things personal when she shouldn't be. She's ruminating on certain interactions, making them a bigger deal than they actually are. What this is doing, whether she acknowledges it or not, is increasing her sense of social paranoia. She's becoming more distrustful of her colleagues at work, and she's starting to experience just more emotional sensitivity. By the time she comes home, she feels extremely stressed, and yet she has to manage her family as well. Maybe at home, she's being a lot less patient with her children as well. Maybe she said something that she didn't mean, that she can't take back, and she winds up feeling less confident as a person, as a parent, as a colleague. Chronic sleep deprivation tends to increase the ghrelin hormone, which is the hormone responsible for making us feel more hungry. It also has the tendency to decrease leptin signaling. Leptin is the hormone that is responsible for making us feel full and satiated. So maybe one day after work, she decides that she's going to treat herself to something that she's been craving to eat. And it happens to be a highly palatable food, something that just tastes so good. Now, with all these things happening in her body, with her hormones, with her stress, when she eats that food, it feels extremely comforting. But the issue arises when she starts to eat that food more and more often to try and cope with the stress that she's been dealing with for the last 2 weeks. At work, people are starting to notice that she's becoming more avoidant. She doesn't really want to sit at the office kitchen anymore. She doesn't feel like talking to people or elaborating the way she used to. She's keeping things short. She's just passive aggressive. And without her acknowledging it, she could be self-isolating. The conflict in these social interactions are beginning to tear away at her oxytocin levels. She doesn't feel she can relate to anyone anymore, even though she's isolating on purpose because she feels emotionally sensitive or easily triggered. What she's slowly but surely doing is isolating herself from the world. She doesn't feel she can relate to anyone at work, and it seems like she isn't able to relate with her own family at home. And she does what a lot of people do, which is interact with her phone and maybe look for YouTube videos that she can resonate with. The unfortunate thing is that she begins to over-rely on technology. Maybe she's now starting to take substances to help her sleep more. But unfortunately, these are not getting at the root cause of her issues. All of these factors are just culminating into a reduced ability to manage conflict or to treat others well, which is leading to social friction and fractured connections in her life. So you can see that any one of these factors, if left untreated, can spiral into a positive feedback loop of depression, where an influence in our biology is affecting our sociology, how we relate with others. And if that's in the direction of more conflict, then it can continue the cycle of tarnishing our mental health. So now our psychology is affected. And again, if left untreated, certain factors can just continue to perpetuate depression over time. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that experiencing any one of these circumstances or taking part in any one of these habits on their own will cause depression, but rather if these aspects are the result of untreated dilemmas and eventually become dilemmas themselves that are left untreated, because of the interaction explained by the biopsychosocial model, these can open up the door to cascading consequences that reduce mental health over time. And therefore, our behaviors, people, habits, places, decisions, etc., that promote a positive feedback loop of depression. Addressing our mental health in a sustainable way will be a multi-dimensional journey to avoid habits, decisions, people, places, thought patterns that lead to positive feedback loops of depression. Change in one of these spheres of influence will have consequences in the other two spheres of influence. The feedback is triangular, but can also be back and forth in the same direction. What that implies is that sometimes improving features of our biology for the sake of alleviating depression will mean that we will also have to address aspects of our sociology and psychology, and the other way around. I hope you're starting to see that becoming whole is the goal, because more gay is the way. Yes, I just said that. It rhymed. I wish this work was as easy as understanding it and explaining it. Applying this knowledge can be extremely difficult, and there is so much nuance involved. At the same time, it can be awesome if and when we reflect about just how much multidimensional progress we can make by confronting even just one feature of our lives, or considering what actions, communities, people, environments, habits, etc., will yield the highest return on investment in all areas of our lives for better mental health. Cycles of depression or depressions can be avoided by minimizing, escaping, or refraining from features in our lives that push our systems of body, mind, society in the direction of less life. We can begin to uncover whether or not a specific feature in any one sphere of influence is leaving the door open to positive feedback loops of depression by asking if that aspect promotes life or if it diminishes life, not just in that sphere of influence, but in the other two realms of influence, and whether or not it promotes longevity. I've been thinking of a way to assess how an aspect in our lives can either be promoting life or diminishing life. And I found two parts to that analysis. The first part has to do with our five senses, in the literal sense and in the metaphorical sense. How one might begin to analyze or reflect on whether or not something is an aspect in their life that is diminishing or promoting life is by asking, does it help me feel more, touch more, sense more, literally and metaphorically? Are we more related to that aspect, for example? Are we able to see more, identify more, or is it clouding our eyesight, literally and metaphorically? Does it help us taste more, or speak more, express more? Does that feature help us hear more, listen more, or does it make us want to cover our ears or wish that we had the power to mute the world? Does that feature help us smell more? Is that aspect refining our ability to distinguish between what smells right versus what smells wrong? So both in the literal and metaphorical sense, I think we can ask these questions of our five senses to be able to tell whether or not something in our lives is either promoting life or literally diminishing life. If you didn't have any of these five senses, I'm not sure if one could be considered a living human creature. The next part of the analysis is whether or not that feature in our lives is promoting anhedonia, which is the reduced ability to feel pleasure, because there are certain substances that will heighten our senses, but to the extent that everything else apart from it seems bleak. Things that were once pleasurable are no longer as enjoyable, and we feel that we are over-relying on that feature for us to feel pleasure in our lives. And so asking ourselves whether or not something is increasing anhedonia is going to be helpful as well, because our five senses can be heightened, but sometimes to the detriment of our beings and our ability to actually feel pleasure from things that we would normally be experiencing pleasure from. While dramatic, it can help to imagine the extreme consequences of our circumstances or the features we dabble with. By envisioning the worst possible outcomes, we can strategize or mobilize resources in other realms of influence to prevent the potential of slipping into cycles of depression. Now that we've spoke about this concept in a broad way, let's begin by discussing questions that will help us to evaluate the biological, psychological, and sociological factors that influence depression.